Welcome everybody. On behalf of the Trobe University's Institute for Agriculture and Food, it gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to this virtual launch of the International Service for the Acquisition of Agri-Biotech Applications, an organisation known as ISAAA. The Brief 55, Global Status of Biotech Crops and the Oceanic Perspective. My name is Tony Bacic. I'm the Director of the Trobe Institute for Ag and Food and the moderator. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of La Trobe University the traditional custodians of the lands where its campuses are located in Victoria. We recognise that Indigenous Australians have an ongoing connection to the land, and the university values their unique contribution both to the university and the wider Australian society and to the custodianship of our unique biodiversity. How we will feed the growing population, estimated to reach 10 billion by 2050, that is an increase of 25% over the next 30 years, but requiring 70% more calories. And how we do this with sustainable and nutritious food is an extremely important issue for the peoples of the Indo-Pacific region and indeed the planet, particularly as we try to reduce the impact of human activities on the environment and promote healthy diets as a preventative medicine for human health. Safeguarding food security and nutrition is critical in order for countries to overcome problems of hunger and malnutrition, estimated to impact 2 billion people today. That is approximately a quarter of the world's population. Socioeconomic benefits of biotech crops have been documented in the last 23 years by ISAAA, showing that biotech crops have contributed to increasing productivity that contributes to global food, feed and fibre security, supporting self-sufficiency on a nation's arable land, conserving biodiversity, precluding deforestation and protecting biodiversity sanctuaries, mitigating the challenges associated with climate change, and improving economic health and social benefits. These economic benefits, health improvements, and social gains obtained through biotech crop adoption must be made known to the global community so that farmers and consumers can make informed choices on what crops to grow and consume respectively, to the policymakers and regulators to craft enabling biosafety guidelines for commercialisation and adoption of biotech crops, and to the science communicators and the media to facilitate correct and effective dissemination of the benefits and potentials of the technology so that consumers have the information to make informed choices. Today you will hear from research experts and a farmer in agriculture and food production about how biotech GM approaches are doing just that. The COVID-19 pandemic, a global crisis, has exposed the fragility of global supply chains, the national importance of food security and a strong manufacturing base to value add to our largely commodity-based agri-food sector. This crisis has jolted our thinking on many fronts, and as we emerge out of this crisis, which we will more rapidly than anticipated only a short time ago due to the development of vaccines by GM technologies, do we revert to the status quo, or do we dare to do things differently and grasp a unique opportunity for the planet's agri-food sector to produce clean, safe and nutritious premium quality foods? This webinar launch summarising the benefits accrued through the introduction of biotech GM crops is indeed prescient. More than 2 in 5 consumers globally are spending more time cooking and preparing food at home. I know I am. Instead of getting takeaway and going out, consumers are experimenting with recipes and cuisine as they spend more time at home. Internationally, export and import markets have changed dramatically this year as our supply chains that are based upon an on-demand need have been found inadequate. And so is the realisation that we need to challenge ourselves to think differently about what we eat, how we produce food, and our own consumption and the ways that we do that, which can be sustainable and viable in the long term. One thing is for certain in these very uncertain times, business as usual is not an option. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers who are presenting today. Dr. Paul Teng from ISAAA. Paul is the Managing Director NIE International and an adjunct senior fellow at the Centre for Non-Traditional Security Studies, both at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He's also senior fellow, Southeast Asian Regional Centre for Graduate Study and Research in Agriculture in the Philippines. He specialises in food security, agri-technology innovations, and sustainable bioentrepreneurship. Paul obtained his undergraduate degrees and his PhD from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. The second presenter will be David Jonicki, who's the Vice President of the National Farmers Federation in Australia and former President of the Victorian Farmers Federation. David is a third-generation grain and livestock farmer who operates a family property at Murrawarra in northwest Victoria. His undergraduate studies in applied science and was awarded a scholarship from the Nuffield Australia and the Australian Rural Leadership Program. And David advocates for the enhanced awareness and confidence in the farm sector and the growth of the national economic, social and environmental value of the industry. The third speaker, before we switch to a panel presentation, will be Professor Jim Whelan, who's the Research Director of the Trobe Institute for Agriculture and Food. With a background in agri-biosciences, Professor Whelan's expertise in the field is evidenced by close to 250 papers in high-impact journals over a career that spans 25 years, focusing on mitochondrial function and signalling of plants' energy and stress status. Professor Whelan is La Trobe's theme leader for the production of quality foods and medicines. He's the Research Director of the La Trobe Institute for Ag and Food, and also the Research Director of our ARC Research Hub for Medicinal Agriculture, and a Chief Investigator in ARC Centre of Excellence in Plant Energy Biology. In 2019, he was elected as a Fellow to the Australian Academy of Sciences. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Paul Teng to present the Australian Oceania report.
Let me join Tony in welcoming all those who have signed in for this webinar. It's a real opportunity this afternoon to share with you highlights of the global status of commercialized biotech GM crops in 2019. Okay. I think certainly COVID-19 has reminded us of how important biotech crops are in contributing to so many aspects of important issues. I think Tony mentioned population growth, there's climate change, which Australians are well aware of, food insecurity, and of course, in the last few years, we've seen the increase in hunger in the world. So all these are important issues for which biotech crops can make a very important contribution. In a short time I have this afternoon, I'm just going to share with you, basically on the adoption status in 2019, some highlights of important crops and traits, and talk a little bit about future prospects. In 2019, 190.4 million hectares of biotech crops were grown worldwide in 29 countries by up to 17 million farmers, spread out quite a bit. For a few years now, the developing countries have exceeded the industrialized countries in terms of the area under biotech crops, as shown in this particular graph here. If you go back to the previous graph, in fact, it's 55.5% in developing countries and 44.5% in industrial countries. Now, this next slide basically highlights the adoption status. There was a slight decrease in 2019, mainly caused by decreases in area in Australia and in the USA. But overall, since 1996, there's been a 112-fold increase in the overall area of biotech crops, resulting in a cumulative area of about 2.7 million hectares. And this figure is significant because the large area of biotech crops that has been grown has seen no evidence whatsoever of negative effects that have been scientifically proven. And that's a very important factor. Now, if we look at the regional performances, Latin America and North America are now almost equal in terms of the spread of biotech crops. And of course, that's followed by Asia Pacific, with about 10.23%, made up of some 9 countries that are growing biotech crops in Asia Pacific. Of course, despite all the bad press, there are 2 EU countries that are growing biotech crops. And then 6 countries in Africa with 3 new countries, which is really a 100% increase above the previous year. This map of ISAAA has been downloaded many times. And what it also shows is that there are 19 what we call mega countries, those countries that have more than 50,000 hectares of biotech crops. And there are another 10 countries, with less than 50,000 hectares. The top 5 countries that grow biotech crops are responsible for about 91%, in fact, of all the biotech crops in 2019. And as we can see, 3 developing countries, Brazil, Argentina, and India, lead, in fact, the charge in terms of growing biotech crops. They're followed by 2 industrial countries, the USA and Canada. Oops, I'm not sure what's happened, but I'm stuck now. I can't advance. Oh dear. Sorry, let me just try again. Here we go. Oops. Apologies for the technology. Okay. Now, despite the slight decline in the global area of biotech crops, there have been some bright sparks. And this next slide shows that these are 3 countries that have shown double-digit increases in the biotech crop area, notably Vietnam with 86% increase in maize area, biotech maize, Philippines 39%, and Colombia a 15% increase comprising both maize and cotton. And maize is important because ISAAA has for years predicted now that maize is the next big frontier where there's lots of upsides for increases. It's important as not just a feed crop, but also a food crop. If we unpack the figures regionally a little bit more, what I said earlier, that Latin America is now equivalent to what North America is growing in terms of area. And our anticipation is that Latin America may very soon exceed North America in terms of area grown. And the other important take-home message, I think, from this slide is that beyond the big 4 crops of maize or corn, soybeans, cotton, and canola, we now see an expansion of growth in the other crops, the so-called minor crops. And this is significant. So apart from area, the diversity of GM crops has definitely increased, especially some of the crops in small areas, things like eggplant, safflower, sugarcane, and so on. Okay. Now, with respect to the actual crops themselves, the big 4 continues to dominate to the global area, especially soybean, followed by maize or corn, cotton, and then canola. In fact, biotech soybean occupies about 48% of global biotech area. Also noteworthy, I think, in the 2019 year, is that Brazil surpassed the US in terms of biotech soybean area by some 15%. And our anticipation too is that, like I said earlier, Latin America is going to continue being a big force, I think, in terms of supplying food and feed to the rest of the world. Looking at the adoption rates of the big 4 principal biotech crops, soybeans and cotton are the ones that have 3/4 at least, I think, of the total crop areas now under biotech crops. Maize, as I indicated earlier, is 31%, but it's a lot of upside, especially in Africa and in Asia. First, canola, 27%. So, yeah. And going closer to home, there's Asia Pacific. There are 17 countries in this region that have formally adopted biotech crops in the Asia Pacific region in 2019. Of these 17 countries, 9 are planting and 8 are importing countries. And of course, our aspiration is to see more of the importing countries also plant so that they reduce their dependency really on imports. In terms of trades, the trade that is seeing the most uptake really are the stack trades. And I think hopefully later on our farmer participant will perhaps be able to speak to this as well. as to why farmers prefer stacked traits. I think in terms of economics versus the single traits and how it helps them. So stacked traits in 2019 increased to some 44.7% of the total area of biotech crops. The map again is quite interesting, showing the distribution, I think, of biotech countries. But basically, again, it illustrates the 19 biotech mega countries, and the countries that are slightly more minor with less than 50,000 hectares. Again, our hope is that eventually we're going to see an increase in the coloring of the map, especially in Africa and Asia. I won't go into detail at all on the figures themselves. Now, what is also interesting, I think, in 2019 was that we are evidencing an expansion in adoption of the so-called small area minor crops by area. Potatoes, for example, the non-browning potato, non-browning apples, small areas indeed, but significant. In Bangladesh, the eggplant, VT eggplant, has increased significantly in area. And also with the resulting effect that pesticide use on these eggplant kind of farms have decreased significantly. Then is the alfalfa, low lignin alfalfa, which is the other important trait. And sugarcane, I think Brazil started planting insect-resistant sugarcane, and also drought-tolerant sugarcane in Indonesia, which is quite significant in itself. And of course, with safflower, high oleic oil safflower, and then the pink pineapple in Costa Rica, which is again an interesting phenomenon there, because this pink pineapple is sweet irrespective of how much sunshine there is, apart from the nice cosmetics associated with a pink pineapple. Now, our emphasis has been on the areas grown in biotech crops, but the other important step to consider when we talk about biotech crops really is the total number of countries that both not just grow but also import and use biotech crops for food, feed, and processing. Okay, so today, some 72 countries have issued 4485 regulatory approvals for some 32 GM crops. And this has happened since 1992. With the US, of course, having shown the most number of approvals, actually followed closely by Japan. Maize has the largest number of approved events. And of course, the herbicide tolerant trait is the one that has shown the most adoption. In 2019, there were some approvals, and the planted areas will be reflected in our next report for 2020, hopefully in less than a year's time. And this shows traits like cotton, drought tolerance, apple, not further non-browning, canola, omega-3, maize, multi-insect resistance, herbicide tolerance, cotton, and soybean. And this is just a partial list. In fact, there are others that were approved, minor events in 2019. In the pipeline, and I must say that the pipeline in many, especially developing countries, is both a long and deep pipeline. I think here are just some examples: non-browning romaine lettuce, Colorado potato beetle resistance, and CPB is one of the most important pests that we all know of in potatoes. Then the drought-tolerant wheat and rice, nutrient use efficiency, water use efficiency, and also salt tolerance. Three very, very important traits indeed for rice, which is still one of the most important staple crops in the world. And I think Tony partly alluded to this in terms of the contribution of biotech crops to food security, sustainability, and climate change. Here are just some highlights from data released through Graham Brooks and his outfit there. The increase in crop productivity, the decreased use of crop protection products, especially pesticides, insecticides in this case, the conservation of biodiversity in terms of not having to cut down more forests to grow crops, and then of course reduce CO2 emissions, equivalent to some 15.3 million cars being taken off the road. Now, of course, the alleviation of poverty and hunger. I think Graham's data has shown that some 17 million farmers and their families have been lifted out of poverty and hunger because of biotech crops. And I must say, living here in Asia Pacific, that without biotech crops, we could not have met the demand in animal protein that we see here in the Asia Pacific, because we import over 70% of the world's soybeans in the Asia Pacific from the Americas. That's how important biotech crops are, soybean especially to us in Asia Pacific. Okay? So to ensure the continued economic benefits of biotech crops, we've got to continue making sure that the sound regulatory systems based on science, that approvals have to look at benefits and not just risk. Of course, the productivity part, with environmental conservation and sustainability, and the benefits that accrue to the millions of hungry and impoverished populations. These are all key considerations, I think, when we look at biotech crops. And of course, the articulation by the Food and Agriculture Organization in this seminal publication in 2017, Challenges Facing the Future of Food Agriculture. Biotech crops help to address all these challenges and more, in fact, because now with climate change, that we see so many symptoms of in Asia Pacific. Biotech crops increasingly, with tolerance to biotech traits, like flood tolerance and so on, will become important tools that we have in Asia Pacific. And of course, as FAO says, we need whatever tools we have to meet the anticipated 50% increase in food demand by 2050. So with that, I believe I've used up my 15 minutes. Thank you very much for listening, and we can take questions later on in the panel. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much. That's a fantastic summary of where we're at, and it's pleasing to see the penetration of the GM biotech crops into the developing countries and the benefits they bring. Next up will be David Jonicki, who's going to give us a perspective from the coalface as a farmer and a major farmer in the Australian scene. Thanks, David. Over to you.
G'day, my name's David Jonicki. Anyone who knows me calls me DJ because I've got a bit of a cracking last name and not even my primary school teacher could get it right for me. I've been asked to speak about a farmer's perspective on biotech crops, and I guess in many ways I'm going to give a perspective on a bit of my previous life as the Victorian Farmers Federation president, of where we had a lot of exposure and to when biotechnology first came into the state, mainly through canola, but then also my roles as both the National Farmers Vice President, and I'm also involved in regional development and in the water industry as well. So I want to frame this conversation a little bit through my sister's eyes. My sister lives down in Melbourne. She's grown up basically off of the farm for a lot of her life, and a lot of her friends, when I meet them, they've got questions for me. And it's always about the perception of farming and what we do, and if it's the reality of what I do as a person, let alone my industry and my business. Because at the end of the day, I love growing food, I love working with my hands, but ultimately I am also, like everyone else here, I'm being employed, I'm a business person, and I want to make sure that I can run a sustainable business for the long term. So when my sister, when I catch up with her friends and we have a bit of a chat, the first thing that always comes up is, when I can move the screen forward, farmer wants a wife. How true is it that there's all these bachelors out there running around? The reality is, yeah, there's a few of us, a few people running around out there, but this isn't the real life of agriculture. This isn't the real life of farmers. And then when I talk to one of her sons, Zach, he's real keen on farming, but his friends in Melbourne, the biggest exposure that they get is Farm Simulator 2020, which is an awesome game. If you haven't tried it, it's probably the easiest way to make money in agriculture, bar doing it yourself. But they don't actually get droughts and they don't use too much biotech in Farm Simulator, unfortunately. And one of the things being in agriculture and in that agro-political sphere is obviously it had to do with a lot of legislation. And Paul spoke about legislation in the prior presentation. And one of the biggest problems that we do have in the adoption of biotech is actually not only the process of getting it out into the field and trying it, but then also understanding it. And I guess in Australia, we've had this history of being very much connected to agriculture, very much connected to the life of the land. And noting that we've actually had a Prime Minister once who actually ran a farm. He knew all about agriculture, and during that period, we had some huge policy gains within agriculture that's actually held us in good stead for not only research and development, but also how we do a lot of the aspects of the future of agriculture, where it's set up, let alone too noting that I lament the loss of the $2 note, the only Australian currency that actually celebrated what we did. And that was in a daily aspect of my sister, of her friends, of my nephew and his friends as well. So it brings us to what is public perception. And unfortunately, when I say I'm a farmer or I say that I'm using biotech, everyone goes to the negative straight away. The aspects of both breeding, using markers, trying to make sure that we are eliminating some bad traits, let alone promoting good traits in our products, always gets lost in that conversation. And I find myself a lot of the time having to explain what I do and how I do it, and that I'm not actually a monster that's trying to both poison the people who I'm trying to feed, but then let alone the environment that I'm also looking after. And things, especially around when we talk around glyphosate and use the chemical usage, these are some of the key touch points that I continually have to both explain and also get through to the wider community. So how I use my language and what I use it for is really important as well. And that's one of the take-home messages I hope people today also understand from our perspective, is that when we're talking about biotech, it's the benefit of biotech, not just the reliance on science itself that actually sells, is this a good or a bad thing? And one thing that we are lacking in agriculture is heroes. We don't have enough people standing up for the benefits of what we do in agriculture and promoting the actual good. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, a lot of this happens by coincidence. So for me in my farm, the only two biotech crops that I am involved with is canola and safflower. Out of the 9 crops I grow, those are the only 2. But when you've got the story like the safflower story, where it wasn't necessarily a trait that was this searched for on the agronomic benefits, but of the broader scope of what can we actually use this crop for its oil percentage or high oleic nature, let alone when you look in North America, how that crop's being used for pharmaceutical benefit. These are the hero stories that we need to tell. These are the things that we need the public to be talking about. And this is the focus that I believe as agriculture, as farmers, some of the greatest challenges that I have, let alone then the biotech industry itself. So when we talk about success and how we measure that, sometimes I'm talking in metric, other times people are talking in imperial. Now that's confusing enough when I'm working with my old man. But when we talk about that in the scheme of what are we trying to achieve with biotech, how is it meant to be benefiting both the farmers and its consumers, sometimes gets lost in the language that we use and the intent of why we do what we do. So I also encourage us then to turn to how are we demonstrating what we are achieving in the right manner for the right clients or the right customers. Now, this can be tricky in the short term, but in the long term, with the conversation that Paul's had around, once again, trying to make sure we're stopping degradation, trying to ensure that the nutrition is front and center. This is the language that we need to use. These are the buzzwords in many ways that we have to focus on to make sure that we're getting cut through. And drought, drought is one of my biggest risks. And when I take a step back, it's when a drought occurs, things like frost tolerance is probably more important to me than any other thing, because those extremes in temperature through climate change are some of my biggest influences on my final yield. The heat stress in spring takes more yield than not getting a rainfall to get my crops to a bigger size. So how do we manage that stress in the crop canopy? How do I make better decisions with the tools that I have, noting that there's a whole suite of things that are around the corner, but I don't have access to them yet. So I've got to keep in business until some of these things land, noting that climate change and the variability that it's presenting is something that's becoming more acute to my business. And that is actually taking different risk mitigation strategies into my hands, which means that I'm not necessarily maximizing yield. And unfortunately, yield is king and cash is king in my business. If I can't do either of those two things, I don't have a long-term model. So here are the 7 things that I guess when I was asked to talk about biotech that I really want to emphasize on what makes the difference to me as a farmer. and that is getting that technology into the paddock. What percentage are we spending on and developing these techniques? How much of that is actually hitting my paddock versus producing peer-reviewed papers and journals, which is absolutely essential to the science-based community. But when I sit back as a farmer and when I am investing into the research, such as through GRDC, I want to make sure that that's hitting the ground, that I can actually touch and feel some of these things that are coming through, and then to make sure that they are relevant to actually what will make the difference to my business. And that comes back to things like, what problem are we actually solved, or what have we actually solved today? What's the next problem that we need to solve on top of that? And once again, frost and heat stress are as important to me as drought, are as important to me as quality. And unfortunately, in most of the crops that I grow, I don't get actually paid on the quality. I've got to hit a parameter to sell it, yes. But then above and beyond that, if I'm a gold or a bronze medal winner in this category, it doesn't matter. All I've got to do is get it home. So what can we actually do to make sure that we're getting, whether we've defined the problem correctly and we're solving it in the acute manner? And then when it comes back to the technology, everything is supply and demand. The cost of a stacked technology gene that was presented earlier is going to be more attractive to me, because when I'm buying canola seed for roughly $20,000 to $22,000 per tonne, for me to buy that extra gene, for me to buy that extra technology is a very small step versus a single stage technology. And that's a huge investment for when I'm putting in roughly, well, it can be up to a tonne of seed a year, that I want to make sure I'm getting the best return on my investment. So stack genes are really important to me. But when we have those discussions, when we talk with plant breeders, it's actually understanding what we're trying to achieve, both by the technology we're putting in, and then what can I sell it for at the end of the day? Who's going to actually take it up? And that trade is really important. And so we come back to that public acceptance. Who are our heroes? Who are actually promoting this technology? I can grow the best crop in the world, and if I can't sell it, it's worth nothing to me. But vice versa, if it's something that the community accepts or something the community wants, it is easier for me as a farmer to make that decision. And when we come back to the cost of developing this technology, the cost of implementation, it does actually fall back to the agricultural community. I have to have faith in what's being presented to me. I have to have faith that I can move this crop. I have to have faith that I can grow this crop. I have to be able to touch and feel it before I actually make that leap of faith to say, yes, I'm going to get into a certain crop and a certain investment that I have to do, let alone all the endpoint royalties and levies that I incur on the way as well. So I want to make sure that money's getting invested smart. So when we look to the future, the farmer looking at chemistry or looking at the plant itself, how that can help with health is a huge benefit to the selling process. Looking at climate adaptation, making sure that we can address things like that, the frost risk, the heat shock, making sure that I'm getting best water use efficiency. And also to the extent of looking at C4 plants versus C3, being able to capture and sequence carbon is now becoming one of the more tradable aspects to my business, potentially into the future. So why shouldn't I be looking at biomass as an actual value to my business, not something that I've got to discard at the end of the cropping cycle? And those efficiencies actually drive my water use. And for me, the soil is my most important asset. The water is my biggest driver in my business, and the biggest risk I have is making poor decisions. And so when we come back to it, the language that we use and the actions that we take really drive that perception and that reputation, that when I sit around my sister's coffee table, I meet her friends, I meet my nephew's friends, those are the discussions that I have. And just to put things in a final slide, just in a bit of perspective, when we talk about agriculture, here's my sort of my big things that I've seen in the time that I've been home on the farm, let alone my family being third-generation farmers. It's the mechanisation has made a huge effect. The fact that we've been able to grow more efficient crops, those dwarf varieties of wheat, have been amazing. Noting that you see Federation being one of the standards of wheat that came through our area, and Olympic, they were massive crops, but you couldn't get any yield out of them. So that's been a huge thing. Soil fertility, pest management, both chemical fertilisers and using integrated pest management, such important aspects to my business. And for me, that's core for us actually keeping my cost of production down, because we have got a very high cost of production in Australia. I don't have the labour that many other countries have that offset my mechanisation, offset my but the other attributes that I have to then farm a larger area. And for that, digital farming for me is going to be one of the huge steps that does go hand in glove with any biotech that I do take on, because I need to make better decisions. And it shouldn't be underestimated that polypipe is one of the biggest and most important inventions for agriculture. the humble polypipe for me represents something that is so simple, but allows me to move water across my whole property very easily and efficiently. That is something that enables my livestock enterprise to really maximise its efficiency itself. So when I think about biotech and its potential, in many ways, I don't need it to be the Rolls Royce of something. I just need it to be the polypipe and actually get the job done, to get my product from A to B, making sure that I'm doing it in a sustainable way. And most of all, that I've got a good message to sell to my customers at the end of the day, because ultimately I'm in a global marketplace. I have to be competitive in that global marketplace, and I can't afford to, first of all, fall behind in my management, but secondly, fall behind in the science that I adopt. So anyway, I'll once again enjoy some questions later at the end of the session, and I thank you for your time.
Thanks, David. That's certainly a fantastic summary of somebody at the coalface of the industry. And the last speaker, before we go over to a panel discussion and have a Q&A, is Professor Jim Whelan, who's going to give us the Australian biotech research perspective and how we're approaching addressing some of the issues that David has raised.
So thank you for your time. So I'm just going to give you one perspective on the global status of biotech crops. To some degree, it'll be maybe an Australian perspective, but some degree, obviously, it'll be what's a personal perspective, because while I don't like to admit it, I started university in 1982, and it turned out to be a very exciting time, because in 1983 was really when the breakthrough in transgenic crops came through, when 3 individual groups, one was Robert Fraley, one with Mary Dale Chilton, and one with Mark von Montague and Jeff Shell, really published the first papers on transgenic plants in the literature, and all doing separate systems. It's important to point out that this came from decades of research on crown gall disease, agrobacterium, and the technology that's behind that. If we fast forward to now, and this is just a diagram taken from this article here, we actually can see how sophisticated the system has got. We can really edit the genome in such fine detail that it's actually quite exciting to believe that we can make anything from a single deletion or repair right up onto multiple changes. So we really have a chance to actually change things very precisely. Now, this is very important, because we go to this example here that's in the literature and tomatoes. And I think probably most of us anywhere in the world would know about tomatoes. And I think there's a common complaint that, you know, tomatoes in the supermarkets or wherever you get them these days don't taste like they used to. Now, I don't really know, but because I'm not a big tomato eater. But the important thing here is that with 6 simple editing steps, you can go from a basically landrace tomato to a refined product. Now, but the really important thing is that through a traditional approach, which would take 50 or maybe more years, that you do it blindly, as well as getting the trait that you might want in terms of disease resistance or increased kind of lycopene content or whatever. You also may lose things. You may lose taste. You may use beneficial things because you're basically doing it blind. It's like driving down, whereas when you're doing it with editing, you're doing it very precisely, right down to that one base pair in billions of bases. So it'd be like driving down a freeway at 100 miles an hour. Now, if you're doing it the traditional way, you're driving down that freeway blindfolded. But you can see out a tiny little bit. But if you're doing it by gene editing, you've got 20/20 vision. So which way would you want to be doing it? And this goes back to, I think Paul showed a map, something like this. And the question I would have here on this slide would be is, how many billion meals have they been consumed with GM products and no adverse cases reported? Now, this is a very important point, because as I think as the previous speaker said, that a lot of people question, oh, like, well, is it safe? Is it good? Is it all these things? But imagine if you had several billion biological reps on any other biological process or any process. Now, I'm not going to make any simple comparisons because I don't want to be seen to be negative about other areas in science. But, you know, various political parties might say, oh, like, you know, this isn't this or isn't that, but yet they accept other science. And you can't take one branch of science and accept it and not take another branch of science and don't accept it. So the decisions really need to be not based on kind of like what you feel or what you believe. They actually have to be based on the science. And the science is that GM is very safe. It's actually incredibly safe compared to lots of other things out there. And that's not to say that lots of other scientific things are not quite good as well. And that really we have to look at, why do we actually get the pushback from certain things? Why are people choosing not to accept this, but then accept other things? So I think this is a very important point. And Paul also had this point here. Now, I'll go through the individual things in a minute, but I think the important thing is here is that it's often pointed out, or it's sometimes mistakenly pointed out a lot, that it's big biotech companies that are benefiting from this. But I would point out that it's individual farmers. 17 million farmers are not a biotech company. They're actually people who are trying to make a living, who are trying to actually better their lives and things like that. So they are individual people that if you actually have a better environment, that's a benefit to everybody, not just a biotech company. You're reducing CO2 emissions, which I think it's widely agreed that climate change is the biggest problem facing the world in the long term. You conserve biodiversity because you're not using more chemicals and things like that. You're not getting drift from agricultural land into parks and things like that. And you get increased production. At the moment, for traditional crops, we often have to put more into it just to maintain yield. Whereas with biotech crops, we're getting more with the same input. So we're actually increasing productivity. So these benefits really need to be stacked up against what actually is out there at the moment. And they're of benefit to lots of people, not companies. That's really important to note. Now, this is an old analysis from an article to bring it back to the Australian perspective from CropLife. And it's just looking at the increase in farm income, whether it be canola or cotton and things like that. And you can see the increase per hectare and things like that. Again, this is important for regional communities in Australia. Now, so I'm not going to read through all this point here, but there's a few things that are very important. First of all, farmers work in regional communities, and the sustainability of not just the farm, but of the regional communities depend on farmers being sustainable and their income and things like that. So every time a farmer actually goes out of business or can't make a profit, it not only affects the individual, it affects the whole community. Okay, there's increased productivity. This is very important in a world that we're losing land, arable land, every day to salinity, climate change, drought, and other things. Okay, we reduce the amount of chemicals that we put in the environment. Now, this again is very important because both studies in Australia and I'm sure elsewhere show that by not applying the chemicals, not only you're not putting the chemicals on the crop, you're not getting any drift into neighboring kind of national parks. So you've increased biodiversity by actually using GM crops. And also, even with the amount of fuel that you're not using to put those chemicals on again and again and again, you reduce CO2 emissions. So there's benefits to the whole of society from actually from using GM crops. So, and I'll just finish up on this. This is an article. This is from an article that was published recently on the ISAAA report, and it was pointing out like, that it was a very good report, but that also is about the inequity of biotechnology impact. That I think, as Tony said at the start, 2 billion people face food insecurity, and almost 30% of children under 5 actually have some sort of growth defect because of malnutrition. But yet, less than 1% of the total population of the developing world is positively impacted by biological innovation because of the pushback on it. The cost of getting crops to actually market, the biotech crops to market, $150 million. And we're asking developing countries that are poor and like to try to actually cover these costs. The amount of income that will be lost by low and middle income nations by 2015 will be over $1.5 trillion if they're actually not allowed to go forward with these technologies. So I will actually kind of make the point is that one of the UN sustainable goals is food security and biosecurity and equal societies. Now, I would make the point is that feeding the world is not a scientific problem anymore. It's a regulatory problem. And it's actually very important that we actually now address this regulatory problem to actually ensure that we can actually get the advantages of this technology. So I'll just thank you for your time, and I'm sure we'll all try to answer any questions people may have.
Thanks, Jim. Much appreciated. We're now going to move to a panel discussion. But before we do so, I'd like to introduce a couple of other members who will be on the panel. Maha Harijanan. Maha is the Global Coordinator for ISAAA, and she's the Executive Director of the Malaysian Biotechnology Information Centre. She is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Petri Dish and co-founder of Science Media Centre Malaysia, and an international consultant for the UN FAO Biosafety Project in Sri Lanka. She's an adjunct lecturer at Monash University, Malaysia, and part of the university. She has a PhD in science communication from the University of Malaya, and is a renowned science communicator in the agri-biotech field, and was listed as the world's 100 most influential people in biotech by Scientific American worldwide in 2015. The other member of the panel is Professor Marilyn Anderson, who's from the Trobe Institute for Ag and Food. Marilyn has over 40 years experience in scientific research in the area of plant biochemistry and genetics. She holds the positions of Professor of Biochemistry at La Trobe University. She's also the Chief Scientific Officer and Director of Hexima, one of the early and still viable biotech company, plant biotech companies in Australia. And she was a founding scientist and director. And she's actively engaged in the R&D of plant-derived proteins and peptides for the applications of human therapeutics. Marilyn is also a CI in the Australian Research Centre Council's Industry Transformation Research Hub for Medicinal Agriculture, and a fellow of our academy in Australia, both the Academy of Sciences and Technological Academy of Sciences. The other member is Ola Romero Aldemita, and Ola is also from ISAAA, and she holds a PhD in botany from Purdue in Indiana, and has postdoc fellowships at the Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg, Germany. She obtained her undergraduate at the University of the Philippines in Los Banos, and she leads the development and publications of ISAAA's annual global status of commercialized biotech and GM crops, coordinates capacity building and biotechnology and biosafety activities in ISAA's biotechnology information centres, and she is a leading scientist lecturer in ag biotech in the Philippines and the region. So with that, we'll throw open to the panel discussion and address some of the questions that have appeared. And so perhaps I can start by asking Marilyn to comment on, seeing we finished on that note with Jim talking about the regulatory environment, and whether she'd comment on the regulatory environment in Australia for agricultural products and for food, and how that addresses the safety and health concerns that many people have about biotech foods.
Thank you, Tony, and welcome everyone to this webinar. So, gene technology is really tightly regulated worldwide, and actually in Australia we were leaders in getting regulations up and going quite early. So in Australia, gene technology is regulated by the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator, which is within the Department of Health. And they work under the Gene Technology Act, which was established in 2000. They focus on three things, so that any genetically modified organism in Australia should not affect human health or adversely, should be safe, and it should not affect the environment. That's entirely what the regulator operates on. They have some strict guidelines and regulations that everyone has to adhere to if they work in this industry. So it starts at the universities or the people who do the research. So the type of facilities they use and the type of research that they're allowed to do. This office also handles requests for permission to release any organisms into the environment, and they also would administer any penalties to anybody who doesn't obey the regulations. Once a gene, an organism is past the early developmental stages, then it goes through 3 more regulatory agencies. One is Food Standards Australia for food, then the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, if it's a pesticide or and the Therapeutic Goods Administration, if it's therapeutic. Now, all countries have very strict guidelines, and so if you produce a genetically modified food in Australia, you would not be able to export it to another country unless it's also passed their regulations. And that means that some of these crops that we're talking about, like corn, the only way that it can be exported around the world is if various countries independently through their own regulatory agencies approve that genetically modified food. And you will have seen the same with the COVID vaccine, as every country is separately going through their own approval processes. Very tightly regulated and very expensive. And as Jim says, it may cost up to $136 million to get a product all the way from discovery out to the market, if you're lucky. And I would say that over $100 million of that would be regulatory expenses.
So Marilyn, there's 2 questions which we can address to you while you're on there. One is, what about plant breeding innovations and that avenue for getting GM crops to market? And the other was, how long does it usually take to get approval of a trait?
Approval of a trait, I can answer that more quickly, will often take probably up to 10 years. There are many experiments and field trials that you need to do, tests on animals to ensure that the product is entirely safe and that there is absolutely no change in that product. Great deal of attention on, even before people start, on potential allergenicity or toxicity. So that's very extensive, takes a long time. The other question, Tony, was?
Well, about the avenue of plant breeding innovations and whether that's a faster way to go through plant breeding. I presume plant variety rights is what they're asking the question about, with the AGTR currently reviewing that legislation.
Yes, you may know more about that. It still would be subject to plant variety rights once you had developed a plant. That I haven't followed a lot. You may know the answer to that more than me.
No, I'm not, but I think that I don't know how that, but I would presume before, I mean, you'd have to go through the regulatory safety issues about a GM event, but then you also, whoever the company is that wants to market it would have to get protection as well.
I should probably add that if you're a scientist and you have a new trait, you develop that technology, but there's also a whole lot of separate technology as to who owns the elite germplasm in which you put that trait. So that wouldn't belong to the scientist. That's why a lot of this technology is left in the hands of the big agri-biotechnology companies, because they own the valuable germplasm that is protected by plant variety rights, and that there's extensive work done to make sure that introduction of the gene, your trait, does not in any way impact on yield. Because David is correct. Any genetically modified crop will be rejected, no matter what the trait is, if it has more than a 5% impact on yield. Yield is king.
So David, I just wondered whether you wanted to comment, because there was a question there about the price differential you would get for a crop that's GM versus non-biotech.
Thanks, Tony. That's always a bit of a hard piece of string to measure. However, like if you can reduce the amount of inputs that I've got to control a certain weed or a pest, could be up to $50 a hectare. But then it's the advantage of it not taking any of my potential away. So by the time I see that either that pest, disease, or plant that I need to manage, it's already taken some potential out of that crop. So getting on to that early could be a 15% increase in yield, purely because it's something I don't need to manage at that time. So once again, when we talk about stacked genes, it is about making sure that I'm getting a benefit out of that. But if I can't sell that product at the end of the day, it's zero to me anyway. But the economics of growing anything that is has got some biotech in it, it needs to stack up as far as the conventionals go. And when we look at products such as wheat that was mentioned earlier, I know that the political will for that is as much of an issue as the actual technology that is available to that crop variety, and it's that acceptance that the benefits that it can potentially give both the industry, the ag farming community, and then the broader community is one of the real probably tough nuts that we've got to be challenged with in the next decade.
Thanks, Dave. Jim, maybe you'd like to comment on how the technologies advanced or shortened the time frame between the bench and getting a trait that could potentially be tested in the field. How much of a difference has that made to the identification of traits?
Well, I think the reason is, it's shortened it considerably, because the reason being is now you can be very precise with the modification you make. So therefore, rather than trying to take, get two varieties and cross them and then breed the beneficial trait into another, which can take several rounds of backcrossing in years, you can actually do it instantly. And importantly, you're not losing what they call the unknown unknowns. When we started breeding crops 5,000 years ago, we didn't know that 5,000 years later we'd need resistance to this fungus. So we didn't keep those things. So therefore we've lost a lot of we've lost a lot of that diversity. We've lost a lot of those things in breeding programs. Now, that's not a criticism of the traditional approaches. They've been very good. But really, this technology allows us now to go back to the land races and really go back and redo all that again, but in a very precise manner, while we maintain a lot of the extra benefits like nutritional quality, disease resistance, and other things like that. So, like the example I gave was from tomato. They did it with 6 editing events, which can be literally now with the prime editing technology, that can be done in a single transformation. So that really is kind of quite powerful. And the other thing that would be very important there is for developing countries, or even in developed countries, we could actually do it for crops that we haven't traditionally used. Rather than having to go back through decades of breeding, we could apply it instantly. So therefore we get to try a lot of different crops very fast. So I think that's again, would put diversity into agriculture and would maybe make us more resilient if we actually had what you might call a plant COVID coming along that hits out a major crop and things like that.
Thanks, Jim. Maha, perhaps you could comment on a question that's come through about China, and has it shown any great interest or investment in biotech crops, and is China the next big producer worldwide?
Tony, I think I will pass that question to Ola. She will be a better person to answer that.
If she's
yes, thank you so much. Actually, there are 3 questions I need to answer at this time, because there were questions about China. China is actually the #2 country in Asia producing biotech crops, and it's cotton and papaya, the PRSB papaya, ring spot virus resistant papaya. And it was shown in Paul's presentation that it is let me see that. It was in the top 10 countries planting biotech crops. So currently there was a release last week that China is rebuilding again its biotechnology program. So it will be it's not continuing, but it's going to be revamped or streamlined so that there will be more crops, more biotech crops to be approved and provided to the farmers. And then the second question was on Europe, what's happening in Europe. So currently we have 2 countries planting biotech maize. This is MON 810 BT corn. and it is in Spain and Portugal. They have been planting it since 2002. And before, we had around 10 countries planting in Europe, but then because of the differences in opinions and political opinions there, 2 countries remained. These are Spain and Portugal. And also there's a question on Kenya is currently growing BT cotton. That's not included in our 2019 data as yet, because they have started planting in 2020. So we will be putting Kenya in the 2020 data. And also, yeah, we have 6 countries in Africa now. And it's very good that Africa, which was we say the last frontier, but they have been revitalizing the regulatory system, and now we have 6 countries, and when we report the 2020, we will have 7 countries, which will now be including Kenya. Thank you.
Thanks, Ola. I think also to add to the China discussion is that we're aware that actually China is developing GM, in a lot of GM crops. For example, in rice, they are actively testing them in a controlled environment. They're not approved for food use yet, but they have many of their major crops that they've actually developed GM traits for and that they're ready to roll out, and it's just a decision as to when to proceed. I just wondered whether, whether I could ask you about a communications issue, and is that what can the agri-food sector learn from the biomedical sector, where these GM biotech technologies are accepted as vital to the production of our novel drugs and vaccines, the COVID vaccines, as we've just found out, that came into play within 12 months. And yet we still have consumer suspicion around foods, but not around medicines. You want to address how you see that as a challenge from a communications point of view, or?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Tony. You know, the thing with science communication, there's no one single answer. There's no one simple answer. But I would say the difference between medical biotechnology or any medical technologies and agriculture is, in medical biotechnology, we are not given so many options. Insulin, for example, we don't have another insulin produced through another technology. It's recombinant protein. But in agri-biotechnology, we've got so many options. Plus, the underlying factor is also food is very close to our heart, our culture and sentiments, emotions. So when people go and buy food, they will see nature's wonder, farm fresh. So, you know, these are the words that sort of resonates with them. Food from the countryside, fruit from the back, you know, cottage industry. So these are the challenges that we face when we bring in all these new technologies. So I think we have to, like, that is why as a science communicator, I always say, go into the storytelling mode of, even if it is genetically modified, it is produced by a farmer like David in the countryside. It's not coming from the factory, and genetic modification itself is not new. But I would also urge scientists to use this opportunity, this COVID vaccine opportunity, mRNA technology, and say that, you know, these technologies have been there and it is not new and we need it, and how it is saving life. So as I said, there's no one answer, but then the sentiments of people is different when they approach medical and food, because medical is always between life and death. Whether if I'm really very bad diabetic patient, I have to take it, or I don't take it and I suffer. But in food is, I've got so many options. So this is where scientists have to really come together, and not only scientists, farmers and all the other communicators have to come together and weave our information together so that it resonates with the public.
Thanks, Maha. I saw a question, and I know David's partly answered it too, but Jim, there's a question about what's going on with vertical farming and controlled growth in controlled growth environments indoor, about enhancing nutrition and is there anything in that space that's developing?
Yes, I think that is also science communication in it. I saw David gave some answers. Now, the thing is, I think the public and other stakeholders, including policymakers, must understand that in agriculture, with all the challenges that we are facing, global food security, climate change, and restricted resources, with all these things that we are facing, there's no one solution that will address all these problems. So we need urban farming. That is why ISAAA is pro-choice. We want urban farming, we want indoor farming, we want traditional biotechnology, we want organic, and also we want this modern biotechnology, genetic modification and new breeding technologies. So imagine urban farming is not as simple as, you know, we need all the infrastructure, the building itself, and the water system, the fertilization for the fertilizers to go through. So we need all these things. And imagine in a country which is really poor, somewhere in remote Africa, no, they can't build this. They're still traditional farmers. So if we can give them better seed, which is drought tolerant, saline tolerant, so you know, this also helps. So we need all technologies. That's my answer to that question.
Jim, did you want to comment too? Thanks, Maha.
Yeah, I would comment is that I'll go back to the point about that I think that was made by the previous speaker, is that maybe people like David have been and when I say too successful, I don't mean, but they're too good at what to do, because they do consistently come up with good quality food. And in what we'd say in lots of countries, now not all countries, food is relatively cheap. If you look at the cost of food now, we'd say in the European context, that might be seen as anti-GM. You look at the cost of food now for an average family person and the proportion of their income it takes compared to 100 years ago, it's tiny. They're now spending more on shelter and their new car and whatever, they're changing their phone every year than they would be on food. Whereas 100 years ago, 50 to 70% of their income might be going on food, and then only the rest on shelter. So first of all, we need to acknowledge, and I'd agree with, I think David's one is very good. We actually do, like, you know, I don't think, we do need heroes and farmers, but maybe they are heroes, but we just haven't recognized it. So that's what gives people the choice. And I think then we need to kind of say, well, that's fine if we have that choice, but we should make that choice for everybody else in the world, because for the 2 billion people that don't have food security and that need this technology, we shouldn't be in the position, well, I don't need it, so I don't care. So that's what I would say that goes on. And while, again, I think it's great if people want to do any sort of farming they want, whether it be vertical farming, or whether it be organic, at the end of the day, none of those technologies in their current forms and cost will actually feed 9 billion people. I mean, if you look at the history of farming, it was the Industrial Revolution and the mechanization of farms that allowed the growth in the population, and things like that. And we really need that farming still. Whereas, so vertical farming, while it's good, is very expensive and it's not feasible for the majority of the people on the planet, because they just don't have access to the technology, the power, and things like that. So really, this technology is what it's needed, and also for the environment, I would say. Like, I mean, so that's what I would say about that point.
Thanks, Jim. I saw David nodding wildly there. I thought maybe you wanted to comment as well around that front.
I think Jim nailed it. Look, at the end of the day, it comes down to cost of production. There's ideals in agriculture, there's ideals in food production, but at the end of the day, when you're standing at the supermarket and you're looking at caged eggs or free range, if you don't have the capacity to buy your ideals, you're going to go to where the money is, and that's where agriculture has a role to play in that space. Now, I'm not going to debate if it's right or wrong, but the reality is people have to eat, people have to spend, they've got other priorities in their lives as well. So I think it's a great thing that we should be investigating, but I can't ever see it overtaking commercial agriculture in the short or mid or even long term.
Yeah, it has to be a very high value commodity in order to be farmed that way. Marilyn, you were going to comment too, I think.
Yes, I wanted to address the discussion on vertical farming. Depends where you are. If you're interested in vertical farming, have a look at Singapore. They've their government has decided that they need to be self-sustainable. They don't have the big land mass that we have here, and they are investing heavily in vertical farming. So again, it depends on where you are.
Thanks, Marilyn. I think we also had I think we've well addressed that one. We've also had a question about animal biotech, and I think Kim is wanting to answer that one. Kim? Doesn't seem like we can reach Kim at the moment. Oh, yes.
No, I think David's probably the best one for that, actually.
Ah, animal biotech. David, do you know anything in that space in terms of Australian?
Oh, look, I know I've been playing around, and to be honest, as a farmer, this is the honest truth here. As a farmer, I can buy the best genetics for a sheep, for a cattle, but if I don't feed it right, you know, it's worthless to me. So I'm actually better to buy commercial grade genetics and put better nutrition through them, and that's going to give me a better result than if I go high genetics and low nutrition. If that's my choice between the two, now in some ways people can say that's a very short-sighted view because you invest in genetics. Yeah, you do, but if I don't invest in my nutrition, my animal is no good to me. However, saying that, I do believe in our lifetime we'll see some huge advantages in animal breeding techniques, and very much like what Jim presented in his presentation around how we actually use genetic technology to get that breeding to a stage where we're getting more desirable traits, where we can see better outcomes through, I know it's noted in animal welfare, but at the end of the day, if a sow has 12 piglets, a sow rolling over on their piglets without a farrowing cage is a public question of what we like to see animals used for. That's going to have as much an effect as how quickly they grow out. So for me, I guess we're at the discussion of having closer communications with consumers, so that they understand why and how we do what we do, as much as their public acceptance of what we do as well. And noting that the fake meat movement is a very interesting discussion prior to COVID. You don't hear probably as much of it post or in the middle of COVID, but I do believe that plant-based nutrition is something that we'll see more of. And as a lentil and chickpea producer, I don't discourage it either.
Thanks, David. I think we've also had some questions in the background about where the biotech jobs are and what sort of training there is. And maybe David to start with, and then we'll tip it to the others. But what sort of skill sets do you think farmers need and the regions need in order to survive?
Innovation. You've got to adapt. You've got to take the challenge on. So whoever asked that question, as I said, just take a snapshot of everyone in the attendee list, look them up on LinkedIn, show some initiative, because at the end of the day, it's how you actually embrace the problem, not to sit there back and admire the problem. It's actually what you do about it. It's the difference between if we're going to survive or not as a community that we're currently growing in. So use your initiative, have a crack. There is plenty of opportunity. It's actually going to be a cornerstone for agriculture biotech. It's absolutely going to be cornerstone for us. But it's up to you to make the step. It's not going to come to you.
Tony, can I answer a bit more about the animal biotechnology?
Sure.
Yes. So I know that in Australia, you already have something going on with pall dairy cows. And I guess this is one of the things that could be coming soon. You know, we are improving animals not only for use for human food, for human consumption, but also for their welfare, especially for disease resistance. And yeah, this is one of those animals, the pall dairy cows, that can be considered and hopefully would be in Australia soon.
Thanks,
Yeah.
No, sorry, Tony. Noting too that we use sex semen as that's probably the bigger advantage at the moment for the dairy industry. Is actually sex semen and how we utilize bobby calves. Because at the end of the day, the welfare issue of what we do with male bulls is a bigger issue than actually if they've got horns on them and not for the longer term prospects. So once again, and it was mentioned earlier, the animal welfare or the community expectations on agriculture is it heightened, and we have to make sure that we are responding to that in a responsible way.
Okay.
And I think just back to the education issue, I think the universities and the teaching environment needs to change from delivering very traditional ag-based courses that many of us were trained with, where it was a very different exposure than happens today. And today, modern agriculture requires a whole suite of skills, including digital and computational and bioinformatics. And so there's many in fact, small businesses that are opening up in the regional areas that would traditionally not have been seen as agri-businesses. But so I think you've got to look at the full gamut. There's climate that's important, so you can get jobs there, soils and nutrition. So every aspect of agriculture now needs that multidisciplinary skill set, including the farmers. So I think we've got to stand up to the plate to deliver courses that are contemporary and cover these areas. I think we're getting closer towards a closing remarks, but I just wondered whether each of the panel members wanted to make a final comment before we go to closing comments by Maha.
There's one question that is still here on the board. What are the biggest limitations that are holding back biotech crops from being developed and released? Maybe each one of us can respond to this, and may I start that one of those would be the acceptance, of course, by the public for consumption and for adoption. And also there are some countries which are still not having a good regulatory framework. So we'll have to help these countries, because this will hinder development and commercialization of biotech crops. Maybe some other panelists can also say something about this. What would be the hindering issues about this?
Thanks, Ola. Jim, would you like to answer that? And also there's a question coming about CRISPR technology and how it's shaping GM crops and what role it has to play.
Okay, well, so the first one, I would say, yeah. I mean, I think we need leadership on it from our political parties. I mean, yes, they're able to show leadership on other things when they want to. And I think they need to show some leadership on this based on science. It's not a question of, oh, yes, let's do it on controls. Nobody is saying that. But I think we actually have to kind of put the science there out with everything else. Like, you know, again, as I say, I don't want to make comparisons to COVID and other things like that, because I think it's important people have confidence in that. But we don't have billions of individual cases where people have taken like something and no adverse conditions. So really, you know, as a scientist, I would never say anything is absolutely proved, but I think we're well beyond any reasonable doubt. And parties that deny that really need to be asked why they're anti-science. They really need to be confronted. And while I applaud everybody that's doing all the education on this, and they have been doing it back since 1982 and 3, I think really it now comes to, I won't say we need to kind of say, why are you anti-science on this matter, but you accept it on everything else? So I think we need to confront it in a respectful manner, but confront it, because otherwise we're not going to get that leadership. So that's where I would say we're on that. We actually need a sensible, informed debate on it. And to use an old term that I hope goes out very fast, like the person who used to use it, fake facts. There's no such thing as fake fact. A fact is a fact.
A fake is a fake.
And that's it. So, and as for CRISPR, the technology, I think it's really important, because again, it gives you that precision. In fairness, back in 1983, when these things were done, there would have been multiple rearrangements of the genome. There'd been multiple things going in. So it actually could cause, some things to go on, but maybe not to the extent. So you have to look at it. But now with genome sequencing technology and the precision we have, we can actually say exactly what's been done to that genome, down to the base pair level. So that is the first guarantee you can actually give. And again, that's documented, that can be lodged, can be transparent to anyone who wants to consume this. And secondly, along with CRISPR, we have a lot of the technologies in the recombination to remove the selectable markers. So the plants aren't antibiotic resistant or whatever for the transformation marker. So it takes that fear out of it that the plants will be spreading genes for antibiotic resistance, which can impact other things, which there's absolutely no evidence that ever happened, but it was actually out there. But with these technologies, they're called terminator technologies, with CRISPR, it really allows us to know exactly what goes on.
Thanks, Jim. Marilyn, as somebody who's taken a discovery through to a product in a biotech company, what do you have to say as a concluding comment?
Look, I'd go back to the cost and the time that it takes, and that most investors nowadays don't want these long-term projects. Unfortunately, it is only the big companies that can afford to take products through to market. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities, but it's just very expensive. And I think small countries like Australia really can't afford a lot of this work. I like the gene mapping for animals and so forth. That gives a more immediate sort of response. But taking a product all the way through to market, that's very expensive.
So you'd say the regulatory costs are prohibitive at the moment too?
Well, we all know that the same goes for a pharmaceutical. We have to look after human health and the environment, and that's first. So this technology will develop slowly unless, of course, there's an immediate need. And I do think that climate change is going to put such pressure on the human population and problems of feeding people that there'll be more pressure put on moving these things through the market, because in reality, we've talked a lot about the opportunities, but in reality, there's only two traits that are really out there. That's insect protection and herbicide resistance. The others are small, they're not major commercial projects yet.
Thanks, Marilyn. And perhaps the person at the coalface, David, is the last word there, and then we'll hand over to Maha to close.
I agree with leadership. When we talk about this technology, we're dealing with, neutrons, protons, electrons, and morons. And unfortunately, when we talk about public perception, we don't have leaders that are willing to put their hand up and say, actually, that's incorrect. The real science is A or B or C. And the reason why we believe in science is because we're actually living in a civilization built on science. And I fear that, and it was mentioned too about the research funding cycles, when it's based on a 3 or 5 year cycle, you can't get anything done. And when we've got politics views, I should say, based on that as well, we don't have any vision, we don't have any commitment to that vision, and that, I feel, for us as a country, we can't afford to be squandering or bickering between ourselves, because the game's much bigger for us. Climate change can decimate our food production and the export advantage that we have now. Don't be mistaken by that. And that's one of our greatest challenges of our time. And when we've got politicians that want to argue the toss if their constituents will vote for them or not because of what they perceive to be a winnable seat, I just fear that our politics is going to be slipping to that fourth dimension more than us focusing on the real game. So for me, it is about leadership. For me, it is about standing up for what's right, and having people with the gumption, those heroes or leaders, whichever way you want to phrase it, those people to actually take the mantle and hold steadfast to the cause. And that is, the amount of people who consume food around the world and are not poisoned from Australian produce. We are great producers, but we also we can't rest on our laurels. We've got to make sure we're sustainable. We've got to make sure that our cost of production is managed. But most of all, and I mentioned it earlier too, it doesn't matter on the management or the techniques we have. They can always be copied. The key thing is that we're pushing forward and making sure we're looking to that light on that hill, that vision where we can be adopting the best techniques, the best technology within the agricultural community to ensure that we are best in class, at least pushing somewhere near the top. We don't have to be the ones taking the product fully through to commercialisation, but we need to be at the table to get access to that technology.
Thanks, David. I think a great retort too to the fake news. I like that quote. I think with that, we should get Maha to provide closing comments on this. Thanks, Maha.
Thank you, Tony. I think David did a very good summary, actually. I always believed that farmers are our best communicators. So with that, thank you so much to LIAF, actually, and Trobe for for hosting this ISAAA's webinar on global status of biotech crops. In fact, this is the first time ISAAA is doing this, launching our status our report in Australia and Oceania, and we're very happy to do that. So because we have not really collaborated a lot with Australia, New Zealand, the Oceania, I would like to just give a very brief summary of ISAAA and our way forward. So ISAAA is a pioneer in knowledge transfer on agri-biotechnology, and with almost 3 decades of history in Asia and Africa and very successful accomplishments. We have supported many countries in adopting agri-biotechnology, and we are moving now to gene editing as well. So we facilitated approval, adoption, and supported resource-poor farmers and alleviation of poverty, increased public awareness on agri-biotechnology. We're talking about that, and as what Ola said, the capacity building in biosafety, where many countries are not capable of developing their regulatory system and also do risk assessment, risk management. Now, ISAAA is it's completely non-partisan, and we are independent. We are for credible information, and we are also pro-choice. That is why I said we want all technology to be in the toolkits of breeders, farmers, and scientists. We've got 2 strong centers in Southeast Asia, the center that Ola leads in the Philippines, and the other colleague, Dr. Margaret Karembu, in Africa. And we're now expanding to the Arab world and Latin America. Now, we think really we need to do so much more. Even with 20 years or almost 30 years of GM crops being there, we still face a lot of issues. And I would say, as a science communicator, we will be fooling ourselves if we think gene editing will not have any problems just because in some countries it is not transgenic. Now, I don't think so. There will be, people are already cooking up things against gene editing. So we still need a lot of initiatives. David nicely said this, the post-truth, the post-trust, the proton, electron, and I don't want to continue. But this is the era we are living in. As the advancement in biotechnology, in sciences, is just so rapid, but still we are living in post-truth, post-trust, post-era, where people are still dismissing science. Look at COVID, for example, the vaccination, vaccines. Why is there so much of hesitancy? In spite of the science education and all the education that we go through. So science and technology is still difficult for public to follow the developments. These are the concerns, and this is why we need more awareness programs and engagement. So ISAAA, after our 3 decades of successful impact that we have created, we are now moving towards a consortium. So we are calling ourselves BioTrust Consortium, which will be anchored by ISAAA, but we are going to be branding ourselves as a consortium, BioTrust, to remove ignorance and fear, to build trust and transparency, and to obtain social licensing. This is what David said in the beginning. He said the public acceptance. So this is social licensing. We get our approvals from the regulatory agencies, OGTR in Australia, other regulatory agencies around the world, but the final approval actually comes from the people. And that is why the question from someone on Europe, what's happening in Europe? Europe actually approves, but then it's not adopted. So this is where the social licensing comes from. So we want to address all these things. So purpose statement is to improve society's acceptance of novel food and new systems through biotechnology and by building activities. Our vision is we envision a world where sciences contribute to everyday prosperity, societal well-being, and sustainability. For very long, all this agri-biotechnology has been labeled as making money for the rich countries, making money for the MNCs. But today we want to show that this is for well-being, societal well-being, for public good. So that is the direction we want to take. So what are we going to look at? We are not just going to look at crop biotechnology, GM crops, but still we're going to have a wider scope to support society, sustainable food production and socio-economic growth. So that will include gene editing, synthetic biology, gene drive, use of biomass. So how can biomass be used to produce fine chemicals and value-added chemicals? We are moving from crop to animal, livestock, poultry, aquaculture. During the lockdown last year, we organized a series of animal biotechnology webinar where in total we had 60,000 participants attending from 97 countries. We're going to go into microbial technologies, precision fermentation, novel food, plant-based meat. But I don't think farmers like David have to worry about meat being produced in the lab, because we still need cow and cattle and others for many other industry. And as I said, not one technology can feed the world. So it's still going to be there. All this industry is still going to be there. We are just going to have additional new sectors. So how do we do this? I think this answers a lot of questions on public acceptance. We need to have inclusive engagement strategies. So we want to reach out to all stakeholders in the food systems: farmers, policymakers, regulators, investors, traders, millers, manufacturers, developers, so the entire stakeholder. We want to facilitate social licensing. We have been dealing with regulators. We are going to continue with that, but we are going to go more into grassroots consumer acceptance. And this is where social media becomes very important. We are going to have support social justice to access to technology. So the technology has to be inclusive. It's not just for certain countries which are able to do it, but even other countries which lack capacity, facilities, and expertise. So we want to include all countries, and we also chose social justice, meaning we also want to include youth and women especially. There was one question on other jobs for graduates. I think this is where we need to support the technology, so that the graduates that we train can get into there is a market for them. I have one of my foot in the academic line. I'm an adjunct lecturer in Monash University. So what do we do with the hundreds of graduates that we produce in biosciences? We can only create a market for them if our regulation is enabling, if our policy is enabling. So we need to support new technology, but of course, taking responsible science. We want to ensure transparent knowledge sharing, so non-partisan knowledge sharing, in being independent, being factual. And we want to move into future-proofing the society, so that the acceptance is built for the novel foods and also the other biosciences. So this is what we intend to do under BioTrust Consortium. BioTrust Consortium, now ISAAA, is one of the not-for-profit organization in this space with the biggest followers. We have got the latest is actually 193,000 followers, subscribers in all our platforms. As I said, 2 regional centers, 15 country chapters. One of it is in Malaysia. We've got experience, network, and expertise that we have built in 3 decades. We have built our credibility among global stakeholders. And as I said, Asia, Africa, we are moving into Arab, Latin America, and also Europe. So the consortium itself, we are inviting partners, any partners to join as members. So we're still working on how these membership tiers can be built, but maybe core members where we can be given some funding to run the secretariat and the technical team. And then we can have supporting members. We have where, again, there's some support, and that supports our operational cost, and also knowledge partners. Now, these are partners with knowledge, expertise, who can be our resource person and can contribute to building the body of knowledge. So that is what we are looking at doing. So please talk to us. That's my email address, how we can achieve our common mutual goals. So thank you very much, and thank you to La Trobe and LIAF, and also the participants. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Maha. And just in closing, can I commend ISAAA for the reports that they've been producing for the last 25 years and demonstrating the facts of the biotech GM crop revolution that's been occurring, and also for selecting the La Trobe Institute for Agriculture and Food to host this event. I think it's certainly been and it's pleasing to see that ISAAA is now going to move to that area that's come up right throughout this conversation in terms of getting consumer acceptance and the benefits that flow from this. So BioTrust Consortium, I think, is a tremendous development that's moving on from the ISAAA brand, which is a worldwide brand. So in closing, can I thank all the panel members and the speakers for a very informative conversation. And I think that it's been informative, it's been provocative, and I think that we're starting to have that public conversation that's needed from all parts of the value chain, right through from the researchers, the farmers, and ultimately the consumers and the public, and hopefully we can also engage the politicians. So this will be available on various lives on streams and things like this, a recording of this. So thank you all again very much. It's really appreciated, and have a good evening or a good morning, depending on wherever you are. So, and David's going to go back to his, he's going to go back to the sheep to make sure that the work's been finished on the farm. Thanks, everybody.
Congratulations to us. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I should have said thank you to everybody in the background, the ISA team and the LIAF team. They've done a fantastic job in supporting us. Any of the errors that have occurred has been due to my moderating and managing the technology. So thanks very much, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.